Hello everyone and welcome to another video commentary. In this one we're going to be discussing prevention, detection, and lifestyle. Kind of a loose theme, but what these things have in common is the way we generate knowledge and information and data for health interventions and the kind of stuff that we see headlines about, the kind of things that we might be concerned about, and the kind of things that really impact our day-to-day life and our health. And so these are examples of ideas of concepts and studies and research that are done in that related area. But hopefully by looking at these three kind of areas, you might be able to extend that knowledge to some other aspects of life. So let's get into it. More specifically, the examples that I'm giving you, well, starting with the idea of prevention, this article is talking about mental health in college students. It's necessarily about college students because that's where the research was done. A lot of the research that is done in academia is done with college students because we've got access to that population, right? We can incentivize that, we can interact with. But in the case of mental health, that's probably a good population to be looking at. So we're going to discuss a little bit about some of the stigmas or perceived stigmas related to mental health and how that could impact our health choices. We're also going to dig into some of the challenges of conducting meaningful epidemiology as an example. Specifically, this one is going to be looking into dietary research, like the kind of research on like food stuff and how is it good for you? Is it bad for you? And it's going to be more specifically digging into the biases in that literature and the problems that can emerge with that. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the article about prescription drug marketing, which is kind of a uniquely US phenomenon. But we want to dig into that as well and try to see what the implications are, because when we look at these three topics together, we are seeing cultural challenges emerge from our current historical context, in our current cultural context, and those implications are worth our deep consideration as we think about how to affect change, meaningful change in our own lives as far as health is concerned. So what we're doing here is we're challenging kind of how we think about health, how we do think about health, how we conceptualize health in Western society, and even the things that we know about it. It seems we think it's a bit more clear cut than it actually is. We need to remember that when we're making distinctions, when we're conducting research and doing science, we have to classify things in certain ways. We have to narrow things down, compartmentalize them, and section them out. This kind of reductionism, as it is called, is more convenient than accurate, and that's something that we want to keep in mind. Now, keep that in mind? Well, of course, Professor, that sounds nice. How do I keep that in mind? Like, what does that even mean? You may not have the context really to think about that to a very deep level, but that's what we're doing here. So those distinctions are the things when we look at something in the environment, for instance, and say, that's red. Well, it could be shades of red. It could be some different kind of red, but that's a classification that is useful, right? But we don't want to make the mistake of saying that the word red we apply to this thing in the environment, that is an absolute quality of that thing. And that's the only thing that can be red. Maybe that's kind of a contrived example, but I think you're going to start to get a sense as to what I mean by that as we go along. Our classifications help us order our world, but they don't fundamentally change the world, right? So let's see what we can do with this idea. Beginning with mental health and preventive medicine in college students specifically. So this article is a little bit old, but mental illness and stigmas associated with that does remain a problem. And in particular, there continues to be mental health issues. I think that there are several things making that worse. Some of it's cultural, some of it's technological, some of it could be dietary for all we know. But what we do know is that people are still fairly resistant to getting the kind of help that we need. In the previous video, we talked about military personnel, for instance. That's one example, but that same kind of culture permeates all of our culture. And so mental illness, stigma, and seeking mental health resources is something that we do want to deal with. So this article is from 2009, but it's still pretty relevant today. In that article, they investigated two main things: perceived public stigma of mental health and personal stigma. So what they found through this research was that perceived public stigma was generally much higher than personal stigma. So that would mean people tend to assume that others, vague people, the rest of society views mental health in a certain way or mental illness in a certain way. And so that, what the participants reported was that they thought the rest of the world stigmatized mental health and mental illnesses much more than they did. But personal stigma was probably more important in terms of whether or not people made the choice to seek mental health help, for instance. There were also some characteristics some demographics among which they discovered that personal stigma was higher at this point in time. This is the kind of thing that might have changed a bit over time, but when you look at these characteristics, it might make sense. One is male. That's probably pretty persistent. Another one is young, also fairly consistent. If you can think back to previous health communication classes you've had before, you may recall a term called the personal fable, which is something that we need to deal with when we're making health messaging for adolescents in particular, because adolescents tend to think of themselves as immortal, not in like an egotistical way. It's just you're young and you haven't had to suffer a whole lot of consequences for your actions yet, usually, and so that kind of lends itself to this personal fable. Likewise, young men in particular would have higher stigma towards mental health and seeking help for it, right? So that might tie in a little bit to this. Well, I got this. I got it under control, because the idea might be, the concern might be that by seeking help, that somehow makes you weaker. That is an ongoing concern that our culture is trying to deal with. They also discovered that Asian people in particular demonstrated more personal stigma. This might be consistent if you recall back to collectivistic cultural dimensions discussed in cross-cultural communication, for instance. Many Asian cultures tend to lean more in the collectivistic side of things, and so when that translates to a health environment, what you often see is an emphasis on preventive care rather than promotive care. That was a cultural difference that we have noted with collectivistic cultures. And so part of the idea is that I don't want to be a burden to anyone else in a collectivistic culture. So that might be one reason why the authors found this trend among Asian individuals in their sample. Likewise, international students. A lot of international cultures tend to be, a lot of other cultures from which our international students come from here in the United States, odds are they're going to be coming from a more collectivist place. So I imagine that that same observation holds true here as well. Religious groups. So that's interesting. More religious individuals tended to have higher personal stigma. Perhaps this would be associated with religiosity is also associated with fatalism, you might recall. So things are in the hands of God. So that's not terribly surprising either. A religious individual may be more inclined to accept things the way they are as part of the natural order, as part of God's will, whatever it may be. Poverty is another factor here. Poor individuals are also likely to have higher personal stigma against mental health and mental illness, and that's consistent with poverty and those kinds of, gotta pick yourself up by your bootstraps kind of mentality of being tough and making it through hard times. But none of this is particularly lending itself towards people getting the help that they need. Personal stigma is significantly and negatively associated with help-seeking behavior. So when we say that personal stigma was higher among these groups, then these individuals were also less likely to seek help. That can be a problem, particularly when you need help. And as we've discussed in previous commentaries, everyone needs help sometimes. And so this is it's helping us to get a clearer picture about how and why people tend to view mental health in a certain way and what we can do about that. So not only are we identifying some groups that might be more sensitive to this particular challenge, but we're also recognizing that, well, what we say, what we think about what society thinks actually may not matter as much as our own personal opinions about mental health. Someone could still be motivated to seek out mental health resources if their personal stigma was lower against that thing, even if they thought that society thinks it's dumb. People are self-interested enough that they can do what's good for them if they have the right context. If they've got high personal stigma, that might not be the right context. So the conclusions that the authors provide us with here are that we want to try to find ways to reduce personal stigma, and that might be a good way to improve the mental health issue. So personal stigma tends to be a barrier to health-seeking behaviors, and we would probably benefit from focusing on our own attitudes more than worrying about like what society thinks about that. Now, it is also worth mentioning that the authors say, well, you're not usually going to have high personal stigma and low perceived societal stigma. So this could also be an indicator, right? If someone thinks society thinks mental health is dumb and all that, well, odds are they're probably going to have a higher personal stigma as well. So that's maybe that distinction isn't even that useful, but it is helpful for us to recognize that we're coming back to this kind of central idea of personal agency and what the individual believes about mental health and their own well-being. So we want to probably try to focus on our own attitudes and reducing our personal stigma against mental health. A lot of that might fall on trying to reduce our uncertainty, trying to reduce the idea that there's something wrong with someone in the sense that like they're broken or sick or something. Like mental health is an important part of health, as we've discussed before. We don't usually feel bad about going to the doctor when we have an infection, so why should we feel bad about seeking mental health help as well? So there is some cultural reconceptualization that is probably necessary, but maybe the best way to do this would be, as I've mentioned in the past, to emphasize personal agency. We focus on the individual and say that, well, when you seek mental help, when you need help, mental health resources, when you need that kind of assistance, when you could benefit from it more appropriately, might be to say, because when we say you need that, that kind of makes people feel weaker too and removes their agency. But we say, you know, you might find it helpful to talk to someone about this issue you're experiencing. And that in itself is giving people more agency. It's giving them more control over their life. When you seek help, you are taking control over your life. So we may try to establish that somehow. We haven't had any clean answers since 2009 necessarily about this, but it continues to be an area of research, and hopefully that gives you a little more insight into mental health issues. So here are some things that seem to help. Education, exposure to people with mental illness or to mental health resources. If it becomes more common, that can help too, right? People recognize that this is not an unusual thing. You're not broken if you go to see a therapist or something. That helps. Education, understanding what a therapist does, that's going to help as well. So we can have increased contact with people who have mental illnesses or have benefited from therapy. Like if we're just talking about this more open, well, a lot of people have benefited from therapy. Pretty much everyone who goes to therapy benefits from therapy, right? So that we could normalize that a little bit. Now, moving on with my kind of loose organization of this video, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the Ioannidis and Schoenfeld article talking about dietary research. And so this is kind of an example of epidemiological research or other public health kind of things, but it's no secret that I mean, you hear something new every year, like, oh, don't eat this, don't eat that. It's going to be really bad for you. It's going to give you cancer. It's going to mess with your mood. And yeah, we have some concerns about what's going on with our food supply. And we can look at our society and say, we're not very healthy. Food might be part of this. But we want to temper that attitude with realism. And so I like Ioannidis does a lot of stuff on this. So I've had you glance at a YouTube video of his, but he's very outspoken about this particular issue. Let me explain the study and then I'll talk about the implications a bit more. So they reviewed 50 common ingredients from random recipes in a cookbook. They take a cookbook, they pick a bunch of recipes, 50 ingredients. Then they look at the literature about this. how much research has been done on this. What they discovered is that 40 out of those 50 common ingredients, everything from like salt to wheat to whatever, had cancer risk in the literature. That means they could find papers that said this thing may cause cancer. What does that mean for us? So does that mean that everything causes cancer, or is there something else going on here? So what Schoenfeld and Initis are arguing here is they say that, well, what we're seeing in the literature, that means in the research, in the data available, in the research on this, we are seeing implausibly large effects reported. What does that mean? Implausible. Initis stresses this a lot. Like, does it make sense on its face when you look at it that the same ingredients we've been eating for millennia all cause cancer, right? Well, like, does all food cause cancer or what, right? That's implausible that everything causes cancer. And so we might be seeing an issue here in the research. So when these implausibly large effect size are reported, kind of what the authors are concluding here is like, well, what we're seeing is a publishing bias in the research. What gets published is something that's got sensational effects. That means that the effects may not be super accurate. There are a lot of reasons for this. They also observed that when you perform a meta-analysis, what is that? You see these effect sizes shrink. Okay, so what does this mean? If you've done research methods and looked at theories in the past, you probably have some sense of this. But a meta-analysis is a specific kind of statistical analysis. So if I do one paper saying, all right, I'm going to see if wheat is related to cancer, and I do my analysis, I do whatever it is, my magic, and then I say, here's the effect size, it causes this much cancer, right? Well, first of all, causing this much cancer, remember what I said earlier, that these distinctions are convenient, not accurate. There's no like 0.21% increase in cancer risk. That's a number that we create using an analysis. That's not like, you know, being channeled from spirits on the other side saying like, oh yes, if you eat this much cancer, if you eat this much wheat, you're going to get this much cancer. That's not how it works, right? These are numbers that we approximate for effects. That's an effect size. It's like, okay, you've got a 15% increased risk on average based on these numbers, right? But then if you take a bunch of studies like that, okay, everyone who studied wheat and cancer risk, they're all going to have a different effect size, right? So I take those, I go squish them together and take an average of that, and I look at that effect size, it's smaller. That's a meta-analysis. The fact that it gets smaller is an indication that, well, we might be publishing some sensationalized stuff. That's Initis and Schoenfeld's, that's their argument, right? But how does this happen? I know this can be a little bit confusing methodologically speaking, but what we're trying to get at here is that it's not realistic that everything gives us cancer. That's probably like you can take anything and associate with a cancer risk, right? Because think about how these numbers work, right? Um, these are problems with research, but think about how this works, right? We look at a population, we get thousands and thousands of people. We see how many of them die from cancer, and we connect. Uh, then we look at other things in their lifestyle or something, right? Do you eat a lot of wheat? Oh yeah, all right. People who eat wheat, and then the small group of them dies of cancer at some point, and then we like connect it together and we say, oh well, a lot of people, it, this much cancer divided by this much wheat, and then we get a number. Like even describing it just sounds kind of absurd, right? Well, that's kind of the best we can do sometimes is approximation, but the problem is we forget that it's an approximation. Right? There's all kinds of other things that get tied up in there. I probably shouldn't even be, the weed example is not even that useful. We could talk about alcohol, right? Recently, the outgoing attorney general was like, all right, put a cancer label on all alcohol. Well, that's not exactly how it works. So you see increased risk of cancer associated with people who drink a lot of alcohol, but then like how they say, it's like people who never drink, and then there's people who like sometimes drink, and then it's like, but they're not counting for cigarette smoking, and most of those cancers associated with the drinking are actually like lung cancer and stuff that's clearly associated with cigarette smoking, but they're not really accounting for that. But so like again, if we've got this demon hiding in the back of the room, which is cigarette smoking, and then we just ignore that, And we're like, oh, but see, this other thing's happening at the same time, right? There's a correlation causation thing. Anyway, you get the idea here, right? We might be ignoring some important effects. That's one possibility here. But even without something like that, we have statistical fallacies are very common. Because for one thing, there's one called the ecological fallacy in which we're confusing our level of analysis. If we do that, if we look at that big trend of data and we say, oh, this many people died of cancer, and they were in this group of people who ate a ton of wheat. Okay, well, what about the people who eat a ton of wheat that don't die of cancer, right? Or if we then calculate the number, again, this arbitrary number, not arbitrary, but approximate number of an effect size, and then I take one individual out of that sample population and stick that number on them and say, that's how much cancer you're going to get. That's not how it works, right? So that's kind of a statistical fallacy. So this is common as well. Now, the other thing I want to comment on here, when I know I'm throwing around a lot of different words, this might be a little bit confusing, but when we are performing statistical analysis, which is what we're doing much of the time with big data research like dietary research or epidemiology or a lot of the communication stuff, we want to avoid the illusion of precision. One of my former committee members and advisor and mentor would always recommend, his practice was like, well, all right, when we're calculating these effect sizes, we want to round up a little bit. We don't want to say like 0.01257. We don't want this long string of numbers because that creates an illusion of precision. These numbers are not precise. They are not absolute. These are not universal constants that you can plug into an equation. They are approximations. And so the common practice in statistics is that you round to like 2 decimal points. You don't want to make it seem like you know more precisely what's happening than there is, because we're observing something. We're not like calculating absolutes, right? I've said that probably in 3 different ways now, so hopefully you get the idea. So at the end of the day, if we're looking at the Schoenfeld and Ioannidis kind of work, should we walk away with that assuming that everything causes cancer, or should we assume that there's something else happening here? What's more likely is that we're seeing some biases in the literature. Cancer is one of those things. It's just one of those things. Like you either die by accident or live long enough to get cancer. You know what I mean? Like you get heart disease or something. Anyone who lives long enough will probably get cancer. That's how that works. Does that mean the food causes cancer? Probably not. Some stuff probably does, but it doesn't do us any good to be overly precise and to just torture the numbers until we get an effect size. And that's kind of what Schoenfeld and Ioannidis are saying. And so they want to have more transparent research. They want to have more realistic standards, and they want to change the culture about how and what we publish. The last article I want to talk about, and these aren't in any particular order, but I thought that this would be a good thing to end on because it shows how we take stuff and then we extend it into the culture, and then that culture feeds back into our decision making. So this one is about prescription drugs. Specifically, that study was talking about how the market, the ads for prescription drugs. So first of all, it's legal to do this in the United States. It's not legal to do this in every single country, to have advertisements for prescription drugs. It probably doesn't take a whole lot of critical thinking on your part to see that that could be a problem, right? What this study discovered by looking at these ads and doing discourse analysis is that ads regarding drugs, promoting drugs, provide actually limited health information. What they're mostly doing is making you afraid. They're making you afraid of your illness, and they're limiting your agency. They say little about lifestyle choices. That's huge, because if you want to avoid things like cancer, if you want to reduce symptoms of a chronic disease, there are lifestyle choices that you can make that can help that. You can eat less inflammatory food. You can exercise. For the love of all that is holy, exercise. That's one of the most important things that you can. What I'm doing right now is killing me. I'm sitting in a chair. That's incredibly dangerous. We do that all the time. Lifestyle stuff can make a huge difference, right? But when you watch a drug ad, you are given the sense that there is nothing you can do except take this drug. And if you take this drug, boy, are you taking control of your life. You are reclaiming agency, and you are taking control of your illness. That's what there's these visions of hope. I'm taking control of my illness. They all say something like that. It's like, well, yes, you're taking control by buying this product that this drug company is promoting, that this drug company does all the research on it. They keep all their claws in it, and they have a profit to be made. Now, there are plenty of life-saving drugs that do amazing things, and they have a purpose, but that doesn't mean that everyone watching that commercial should get a drug, a new prescription. Um, you get the idea. Some of this is fairly intuitive, but what this study was looking at is they say, okay, well, the ads really talk little about lifestyle, which, as we know by now, that is the main thing for preventive medicine, which is really, really important because you don't have to fix something that's not broke again. Um, and obviously, they oversell the benefits of the drug itself. Is any of this surprising to you? Probably not. You probably knew this intuitively, but it does warrant our consideration. Like, why do we accept that? Why do we still let these things persuade us? Because they're convincing. They use fear appeals and they lean into us. So they're leaning into us to try and get us to buy drugs, and we know that. And it's hard to say that out loud without sounding just cynical. But we want to recognize that that's kind of messed up. It's a little messed up to have an entire market, a competitive market for, like, all right, selling the most drugs. Now, on the one hand, we want it to be competitive because we want the best products. But on the other hand, should persuasive messaging be doing that? And what this study was showing us is that, well, we can presume, we could imagine persuasive messaging that's more ethical. We could imagine persuasive messaging that improves health literacy and emphasizes things that the individual can do to take control of their own health beyond buying drugs. But as you would expect, the ads don't do that. They're not digging into the nuance, and therefore they're probably not increasing health literacy. So even if they're helping with some symptoms, if we're not improving health literacy, we're probably not improving health. So let's talk about some conclusions now that we've had a chance to look at these different examples and think about their implications. I know they are a little disconnected, but as we go through this class, I want you to continue. I want you to be able to look at a drug ad and be like, that sounds kind of fishy. I want to learn more about that disease, and I want to learn more about the lifestyle choices that can help those symptoms, right? Stuff like that. I want you to be able to look at the dietary research. I want you to look at when you see a headline come across whatever your social media feed says, and it says, this thing causes cancer. Make sure you cut out this from your diet. Well, I want you to be able to look at that more critically and be like, maybe, maybe not. So what are we getting at here? My goal here is not to make you completely distrust our system. I mean, maybe like a little bit. Like I do want you to be critical of our system, because our system, much like our research, the science, people say follow the science as if it's absolute, but then that's completely neglecting the understanding that the science is a method to approximate the truth, not to precisely measure it. You can precisely measure body weight. That doesn't mean you're precisely measuring obesity, right? It is a system, it is a methodology, it's an epistemology that helps us make sense of our world. But our system is not absolute. If you go to a different country, they're going to have different health standards. They're going to have different recommendations for how much mercury is okay to have in your food, things like that, right? Whether or not we can have food dyes, stuff like that. That's contingent on the system, and the system is not beholden to absolute reality in terms of the culture it creates. I mean, maybe on a cosmic scale it kind of is, right? Because, well, we're getting fatter and sicker all the time, so there are consequences to that culture, but we just need to be a little bit more aware of it and critical of it. That's why in this class we're practicing health literacy and research literacy. I want you to recognize the subjective nature of messaging, whether it's a drug ad or whether it's a headline, a sensational headline coming across your news feed, or whatever it may be. And we also want to recognize the power of perceptions. If our perception, our personal stigma towards mental health is getting in the way of us getting help that would benefit us, or that we truly need to be happier and functional people, well, that's a silly reason to be less healthy, isn't it? And so all of these different studies, while they're in vastly different areas, they're kind of giving us a sense as to, well, how we can more critically engage with our environment, the messaging we receive, and our health overall. Ultimately, we all need to take more responsibility for our own health, and that's what it boils down to. That doesn't mean ignoring doctors or never doing, never getting prescriptions for the infection we have or anything like that. But it does mean being more preventive, proactive, and healthy in the ways that we can. And it means taking more action. It means taking more agency in our lives. Sometimes that means, again, a prescription can save your life. There are lots of life-saving drugs. Um, but not everything can be fixed by prescription drugs. Some things can really only be fixed by us from the inside out. And when we do have prescriptions or take medicine or whatever it means, I think that we should adhere to the kind of standard, uh, well, the intended goal of medicine. When we revisit medicine, let's not forget that we should probably take the lowest effective dose, right? To avoid complications. That's standard practice. Sometimes the lowest effective dose is none at all. But this is not, again, to discourage you from getting any of the help that you will benefit from. It is to encourage you to better understand health, health literacy, and your own role in your health. So I hope that these examples were useful to you, and I hope you got something out of that. If you have any questions, let me know. You always know where to find me. I'll see you in the next video.